When I first moved to Mississippi, friends of ours, of Clementine and ours back in the UK, said several things. But several of the things they said made it clear that they had an image of Mississippi. They had an image of Mississippi that clearly made them think of the river. When we said we were moving to Mississippi, they thought of steamboats and cotton fields. They thought of an old guy sitting on a broken porch strumming a banjo. They thought of Mississippi as being a place that exported people and cotton. And I have to say, it was a very outdated image 5 years ago when I moved here, and it is an even more outdated image now. It is extraordinary to think that actually the Mississippi that we know, and the Mississippi that is developing, and the Mississippi that is starting to grow, is completely different from that old stereotypical image of Mississippi. Last year, Mississippi was one of the fastest growing states in America. I discovered a statistic, actually it was the governor who tweeted it, so I stole it from the governor's Twitter feed. But last year, Mississippi's household income grew by 6%, the second fastest growing state in America in household income growth. Our output per person is increasing. Mississippi today is a place where you will find data centers and car manufacturing. It is a very modern place that is beginning to become part of that Southern success story. I discovered, being a Brit, a wonderful statistic that enrages my compatriots back in the UK when I discovered that Mississippi and Alabama combined now make twice the number of cars as the whole of the UK. The UK's got its problems, but it reflects very well on Mississippi and Alabama. And Mississippi per capita output, which is the measure people use for economic prosperity, Mississippi per capita output overtook the UK in 2023 and will overtake Germany this year. So Mississippi is doing something right, and it didn't happen by accident. It's not accidental that Mississippi is starting to grow. It's a result of good public policy. I think there are 3 or 4 key free market reforms that Mississippi's embarked on. In 2021, there were reforms to deregulate the labor market. In 2022, there was a big push for flatter taxes. You'll all remember that, when we moved to a flat 4% tax. Then in 2024, there was reforms on school funding reform to put money actually into the classroom. That came on top of other reforms a decade or so earlier to put the emphasis on phonics. And then in 2025, this year, there was the law passed that will abolish the income tax. All of these reforms are starting to have a potent effect. Mississippi also has very low energy costs, and I think that is undoubtedly a reason why the number of manufacturing jobs in our state are growing. So Mississippi is actually doing rather well, and I want to say thank you to you. It's the support of you supporting organizations like the Mississippi Center for Public Policy that I think helps push these free market reforms to the top of the political agenda. This wouldn't happen without the involvement of ordinary citizens coming along, supporting organizations like the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. So thank you. I don't think it's enough, though, for a think tank in this day and age just to focus on trying to cut taxes and deregulate and do all those other things. One thing that really struck me following the tragic events of 2 weeks ago, the murder of Charlie Kirk, is the importance of us reaching the next generation of young Americans, of us making sure that young Americans understand certain principles about America, certain principles about the free market and American exceptionalism. And at the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, we try and do that. We have the Mississippi Leadership Academy, and I'm going to embarrass them by asking 2 scholars who are currently studying at the Mississippi Leadership Academy and have come here today to, they're wonderful students at MRA. Please stand up. 3? I hope you got permission to skip school today, but thank you for coming. They're part of a cohort of young people who are taking part in this year's Leadership Academy, which is a 2-part course designed to teach young people in Mississippi about some of the free market principles and values that I think we need to desperately preserve. It's also because of that we have events like this speaker series here today. And I should also say, actually, while we're on the subject of the Leadership Academy, we have some amazing people speaking at the Leadership Academy, one of whom is here today, and I'm going to ask to stand up, Shad White, the State Auditor. Thank you to Shad and other state leaders who take the time to come and speak to our scholars at the Leadership Academy. It really is, it's a huge ask on your free time on a Saturday, but that investment in time is a really important investment in Mississippi and America's long-term future. If those young people grow up believing in America the way I do, then America will be, I think, in good hands. But we also have events like today, and today's guest speaker, I think, is he's wonderful. We had him 4 years ago, and it's wonderful to have you back, Daniel. I first met Dan 30 years ago. He wasn't in the House of Lords then. In fact, he was like me, working in the House of Commons. I was an intern working in the House of Commons, and I bumped into Dan at a cafeteria in the House of Commons. And I had a conversation, literally the first time I ever met him, and it is a conversation that certainly changed my life. I had a conversation with him where Dan persuaded me that actually Britain needed to leave the European Union, and that not only did Britain need to leave the European Union, but I needed to join the Conservative Party, the British equivalent of the Republican Party, to help him do so, and that we needed to do this thing called hold a referendum. We didn't know the word Brexit then, but basically everything that came to pass, he described to me literally in that conversation I had with him in 1993. And he did it. He and others did it. And today he's now in the House of Lords. He's been elevated to the House of Lords. We all have to now call him Lord Hannon. But he is very much a friend of the Carswells. He's very much a friend of Mississippi. And most important of all, he is going to talk to us today as to why he is such a great friend of America. I am going to hand over to him now, and please bear in mind, he would love to field questions. I think questions and answers are actually the most interesting part of these sort of events. So please, as you're listening to him, think of a question you've got for him. And Dan, if you'd be kind enough to leave lots of time for Q&As at the end, that would be wonderful. Please, a big hand for Daniel Hannon. Thank you.
Well, Douglas, thank you very much for your kind words. Thank you for asking me back. It's always very flattering to be invited a second time. And it's a particular pleasure to come to this state, not least because, like all British people, I want to get away from the rain. And I knew that Mississippi is famous for its blue skies and its warm temperature in September. It turns out that it wasn't only those cliches that Douglas began with that were incorrect, but it is wonderful to be here. And I cannot stress enough, as an outside visitor, the importance of what Douglas said, the difference between the perception and the reality of this state, that people do not think of Mississippi being the driving force behind AI, data centers, energy-hungry industries. They still have that image of the lonely blues guitarist, the dusty roads stretching through the cotton fields, the isolated white steeples of the churches, the occasional harmonica, and good old boys fanning themselves with their hats as they sit in linen suits. But the fact that those things have happened is thanks to all of y'all, those of you who have been driving change, driving new ideas, and driving the implementation of those new ideas. So, as a friend of this state from across the seas, let me say thank you, and let me invite you to give a round of applause to the people who run the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, who have done all of this. And it's wonderful. People who have come from some distance to be here today. I've met people who've come from Tennessee, from Louisiana. But I want to mention one particular person, and I'm going to embarrass you, Philip, by asking you to stand up just for a second. Philip here has driven from, wait for this, from Boston, Massachusetts to be at this lunch. I think that deserves some recognition. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to, maybe it's the weather, but I want to start with a slightly grisly anniversary. It's almost exactly 20 years since this state was hit by Hurricane Katrina. 90% of dwellings within half a mile of the coast were destroyed. 238 Mississippians lost their lives in the deluge. Of course, although the full force of the storm hit here, there were worse fatalities in New Orleans because the levees broke and there was a higher concentration of population. My daughter and I passed through New Orleans on our way here. We flew in to the airport there. And one of the reasons I was keen to go to New Orleans is because I want to tell you a story about a distant cousin of mine, an American cousin of mine, whose name was Philip Hannon. And he was the Archbishop of New Orleans between 1965 and 1988. And when Hurricane Katrina hit that city, my kinsman, who was then well into his 90s, rushed back to the diocesan office to offer to help. And he found his successor, the then Archbishop, absolutely beside himself with anxiety over the fate of a parish priest who had been lost in the most heavily afflicted part of the city. And seeing that the poor man was so agitated that he couldn't decide anything else, my cousin phoned the army. "Hello, this is Phil Hannon. I jumped with the 82nd at Normandy. I need a helicopter." And a helicopter was duly dispatched. And the elderly prelate then went out in the helicopter and saw immediately, being an old army padre, that there was no way that the priest could have survived. And so he came back and he said to his successor, "He's dead, may he rest in peace. Now let's move on. What's our next problem?" And that, I think, is my kind of clergyman, but also that is my ideal of the can-do spirit that lifted, elevated, and ennobled this republic. And that's what I would like to talk about for a little bit today. After visiting the cathedral at St. Louis, I went to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, which a lot of you will have visited. And as I wandered around, looking at I particularly spent time in the room that commemorates the Normandy landings and then the battle in from there up to the Battle of the Bulge. And I was thinking all the time about what an awesome force the Anglosphere in arms is when it acts together. But I found myself also asking the question, and I think all historians have asked this at one time or another, why did Hitler declare war on the United States in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor? There was no obligation on him to do so. He didn't even hold out for a reciprocal declaration of war on the USSR by Japan. And it was, of course, from his point of view, a cataclysmic decision. It accelerated the downfall of the Nazi regime. And I think in the end that his calculation was the same as the Kaiser's had been a generation earlier, which is he thought, well, all these English-speaking peoples are basically a kind of cultural continuum. I'm going to end up fighting them one way or another. So I might as well get the first mover advantage. Exactly the same as in 1917. And why did he think that? Well, here I would like to take you back to a moment a little bit before that declaration of war, to August 1941, the day that President Roosevelt made the longest walk of his presidency. In a way that I think we now find difficult to imagine, the media of that time had conspired to hide the fact of FDR's polio from the electorate. So every photograph of the president showed him either seated or standing unaided. But on that day, in August 1941, he was due to meet Winston Churchill on the decks of HMS Prince of Wales, and he was determined to walk. He disregarded all the advice of the people who said, well, it's a ship, Mr. President, you may be thrown and land in an ungainly heap. It wouldn't look very presidential. He said, no, I'm going to walk. And so, supported by his son on one side and by a naval officer on the other, he made his slow way across the deck of HMS Prince of Wales, while the band of that ship struck up the Stars and Stripes Forever. And what followed is the neatest visual realization of what bound the Anglosphere together as you could ask. It happened to be a Sunday morning. And so the crews of the two vessels, the USS Augusta and HMS Prince of Wales, were mustered together for a joint religious service. Churchill had chosen every detail personally and meticulously, down to the hymns, down to the reading that the chaplain was to give from the pulpit on deck. It came from the book of Joshua. As I was with Moses, so shall I be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good spirit. And afterwards, exultantly, Churchill burst out, the same language, the same hymns, the same ideals. And when he said the same ideals, he wasn't just saying we're the good guys. Think of the world as it stood in August 1941. The whole of the Eurasian landmass, from Brest and Lisbon to Vladivostok, was under one form or another of autocratic rule. Liberty was thrown back to the English-speaking democracies. The world we have inhabited since that war was a world made by the English-speaking peoples being prepared to deploy proportionate force in defense of liberty. We sometimes talk about universal rights, universal values. But you know what, my friends, we're being polite. These were values overwhelmingly developed in the language in which you are now listening to my words. Free elections, uncensored newspapers, equality before the law, jury trials, habeas corpus. All of these things were ideas that were overwhelmingly developed in the English-speaking world and then exported and, where necessary, defended militarily. Imagine that the Second World War had ended differently. Or imagine that the Cold War had ended differently. There had been nothing universal about them then. Those were values that were encoded in the document that Churchill and Roosevelt signed at that meeting off Newfoundland, the Atlantic Charter of 1941. And they have defined the world that we have lived in ever since. They are what made the post-war world so much more civilized and pleasant than the pre-war world, so much more stable, peaceful, and prosperous. And it's worth thinking about what those values were, because permanence is the illusion of every age. It's the most natural thing to become blasé about what we take for granted. To imagine that every country, when it gets rich enough and wealthy, literate and educated enough, will somehow find its way towards the rule of law, private property, and individualism. But actually, there was something contingent about it all the way through, and we really need to ask what it is that we must do to defend these precepts. What were they? First of all, and let's think as we go through them. Let's think of how we're doing. Free speech, free elections, the principle that you don't take another country's land just because you can. In other words, that borders are sacrosanct. And world commerce, open sea lanes, and a readiness to buy and sell without the beggar my neighbor protectionism we'd seen after Smoot-Hawley. I just want to go through those things briefly in order. And I want you to ask the question, how are we doing? How are we doing in terms of passing on the same world that we have been lucky enough to inherit? Free speech. Well, look, you've all seen the problems that we have with free expression in my country. What may not be obvious at this distance is how much of the problem stems not from legislative changes, but from changes in enforcement by woke and overzealous police officers. When we've seen, like the case of Graham Linehan, the comedian now based, I think, in Alabama, who was arrested basically for 3 tweets in which he was critical of trans people. Tweets. Or the case of Lucy Connolly, who actually served time in prison because of a admittedly pretty unpleasant and intemperate tweet, but nonetheless words, right? Not actions. What we're seeing is not the impact of new legislation, Those were both police actions brought under a Thatcher-era law, the Public Order Act, which has its exact equivalent here and in pretty much every other democracy. It simply prohibits incitement. But what's happened is that it's no longer being used just to mean that if I say, let's go and beat up that guy over there, that's incitement. It's now being interpreted by the police to mean that any hurt feeling by anyone who has what the law calls protected characteristics is a criminal offence. And so this is not a legislative change. This is years and years of diversity training in the public sector and in the police force now having this impact. And it's not going to be easy to turn around. But free speech rests on attitudes, right? It's something we have to model as well as teach, something we have to live. And this is why, take this from a Brit who loves this country very dearly and cares very much about its foundation and its constitutional identity. This is why I can spot the early signs of when that culture is in retreat. Free speech means we have to be prepared to put up with some pretty horrible things, provided they stop short of actual incitement or harassment. Right? The number of people on our side who I've seen forget that principle, who've demanded, for example, legal action against a rap group from Belfast called Kneecap because they were saying the only good Tory is a dead Tory. I mean, that's not really incitement. No one is going to leave that concert and try and plant a car bomb in the House of Commons. Or you may have seen a pretty unpleasant another rap singer called Bobby Villan at Glastonbury, the big music festival, who was leading a chant from the stage of death, death to the IDF. Yeah, pretty unpleasant behaviour, right? But is any one of those stoned concert goers going to take the next flight to Ben Gurion and assault the first soldier he sees? No, it's not incitement. We have to be prepared to put up with really difficult and unpleasant sentiments. And especially at a moment of heightened tension, such as that which has followed the tragedy in Utah. The president-elect of the Oxford Union said something utterly shocking after the murder of Charlie Kirk. He celebrated it online in a WhatsApp group. Shall I tell you the really bizarre thing about that? The thing that I still struggle to get my head around is they'd met. That Charlie Kirk had gone to the Oxford Union to debate this guy 3 months earlier and had been polite, had been his usual reasonable and fair-minded self. First question he said, "Thank you very much." That was a very good faith question, and I agree with a lot of it. I mean, in other words, this was not some abstraction, right? This was not an imaginary person. This was not a concocted version of Charlie Kirk fed to him by left-wing TikTok feeds. He actually had met the guy, and he celebrated his death. Now, I think we can all agree that that is about as bad as it gets in terms of human relationships. But has he broken any law? And if we are not prepared to police that distinction on our own side, then the culture on which free speech rests will disappear. Now that, if you like, the boot is on the other foot, we have maybe a chance to set some ground rules that both sides can accept. And I think we need to seize that moment. Free elections. I mean, guys, this is in retreat all over the world. There are a number of indices, of league tables, that measure the state of democracy, freedom, and the rule of law globally. There's a table called IDEAS, I forget what the acronym stands for. The Economist Intelligence Unit does one. There's a thing called the Democracy Index. The United Nations has its own league table, and they all show the same thing, which is that after 6 or 7 decades of patchy but solid democratization globally, at some point in the first half of the last decade, that process stalled and began to go into reverse. And every year since round about 2011, every year the number of countries ceasing to be free has been larger than the number of countries moving in the other direction. We need to show what the alternative is. And in the most impressionistic terms, when Winthrop spoke about a city on a hill, he meant something that people can see from a distance. Or I should more properly say, when Jesus, as recorded by Matthew, spoke of a city on a hill, right? The city on the hill is imperfect. A city on a hill is viewed from the bottom of the hill. You're not looking at the cracks in the paving stones. You're not looking at the people tipping their slops from the window. You're seeing the hum of industry, the vibration of excitement. You're seeing the soaring skyscrapers of an impatient people, of a nation that not only goes in for drive-through Dunkin' Donuts, but drive-through weddings, right? A nation that turned a functioning dream of freedom into a real nation state and then planted the flag of that nation on the moon, and will now plant it on Mars, and that has drawn tens of millions of people from every continent and every archipelago to come and settle here, often with great success when they arrive. That's the big picture, right? And in order to maintain that big picture, we have to remember the precepts encoded in the Constitution, that process matters more than outcome, that you have to stick to the rules even when it doesn't favor your side, that sometimes the other guys will win the election fair and square and you have to accept it, that sometimes the law will be disagreeable but you still obey it, that sometimes you pay taxes that you don't want to pay in order to subsidize someone that you don't like, but if you don't like it, you change that legally through the democratic mechanisms and procedures created by the US Constitution. This is, I think, the only country in the world where it's the office holders who swear loyalty to the Constitution, not the ordinary citizens. In other words, your elected representatives are there in order to protect that Constitution. And there is a commensurate obligation on all of you to ensure that they do that and to ensure that you police them properly, that you also care about the rules. We the people. There's no one doing this for you. It's up to each of you to uphold those values. The respect for international borders. You know, the current Russian war in Ukraine is different from any other that I can think of since 1945 in this sense. There was no disputed border there. This was not one of those situations where different maps show different things. This was a straightforward case of a more powerful country helping itself to a slice of a peaceful neighbor that offered it no conceivable threat simply because it could. Now that is a problem for everyone who has benefited from the peaceful age that we have enjoyed since 1944. It's a problem for everyone who benefits from the rule of law. Just as at some remote point in the early modern period, our ancestors no longer had to police their own property because there was a functioning police force to do it for them, and all the time that was freed up from that they could then devote to making things and selling things and living better, so a similar precept applied among nations. And that fundamentally is why we have an interest in upholding the rules. I'm not remotely interested in whether Zelensky or Putin is a better or a worse human being. That's not the point. My country guaranteed Polish independence in the run-up to 1939, even though Poland at that time was an autocracy. That wasn't the point. The point was that Poland was attacked without provocation by a neighbor whom it was not threatening, as Ukraine was. Ukraine signed away its nuclear arsenal in 1994 in return for a guarantee, an explicit guarantee that its sovereignty would be respected within its existing borders. Who guaranteed that pledge? Who were the three signatories on the guarantee? The United Kingdom, the United States, and let's not forget Russia. For Russia then to invade is surely one of the greatest acts of betrayal in modern history. But it is also inescapably our problem. I think this really matters. By the way, I can get on board with genuine neutralism. It's not my creed, it's not my cup of tea, but the actual kind of Ron Paul, yes, you know, Putin is a bastard, but wake me up when he gets to Seattle, I can respect that. But this is different. This is leaning on the aggressed side in favor of the aggressor. And that's not who we've been as countries. That wasn't what drove our fathers across the Channel on D-Day. And then the last one, and this is always a tricky case to make in every age and in every nation. But one of the things that came out of the Atlantic Charter and then out of the Bretton Woods meeting was the idea that the world would be more peaceful if we had open sea lanes and unhindered commerce. And my word, that turned out to be true. In the years since the end of the Second World War, the human race has been lifted to a pinnacle of prosperity that previous generations could not have imagined. We take for granted wealth and powers that our ancestors would have attributed to gods or wizards. And that happened because instead of trying to be self-sufficient and do everything for ourselves, we learned to rely on strangers whom we'd never met to supply us with what we needed. And as globalization spread and as trade spread, poverty around the world was almost eliminated. The ways of measuring this are extraordinary. I was born in 1971. In 1971, it took the average American worker 2 months to be able to afford a TV set. Now it takes less than 3 days. In 1971, fewer than half of girls worldwide completed more than primary education. Now, outside Afghanistan, it's effectively 100%. In 1971, a stationary car emitted more pollution than a car today moving at full speed. That is the miracle of globalization. And it is always a difficult case to make. There has never been an age in which that has been a popular position because it's a counterintuitive one. We evolved on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa. The idea of depending on invisible strangers does not come naturally to us. We have caveman brains. We want to have a stash of food to see us through the winter. Of course we do, genetically. And so we're always going to be primed to respond well to protectionist and mercantilist arguments. They will always strike us as common sense. Yes, of course, we can't afford a big trade deficit, and we have to grow our own food, and we can't compete with slave wage economies, and we've got to protect strategic industries. Everyone in every country, in every nation, is always going to be applauded when they say that, because it addresses our intuitions. And yet, every time that those policies have been translated into actual government action, they have served to make the country that implements them poorer. It last happened here with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the 1930s, beginning of the 1930s. They turned the Wall Street crash into the Great Depression. And I think people got their fingers burned. And I'm afraid we're going to see something similar unless we change course on tariff policies now. As things get a lot more expensive, we have fewer jobs, we have less money to spend. Last month, 78,000 jobs were lost in this country, 12,000 in the manufacturing sector. Why? Because the price of the inputs is rising because of the tariffs. Again, this is something that is absolutely at odds with the world that was envisaged when our fathers fought those wars together. So I want to leave time for questions. Let me just close by saying this. I was brought up in South America. And South America, most of the republics of South America became independent, let's say, between about 1810 and about 1822. They almost all copied versions of your constitution. Even by the early 19th century, it was seen to have been a success. And yet it didn't succeed in any of those republics. They lurched from revolution to revolution, from coup to coup, from one authoritarian regime to another. You are about to celebrate 250 years as a nation-state with, for most of that period, one solitary constitutional model. That is an extraordinary achievement. And if nothing else, it should tell you that it works. That it works. I mean, one of the things that I always find delightful about this country is people still persist in thinking of it as a young country. There are very few older regimes in the world than that of the United States. You're older than Italy, you're older than Germany, you're older than certainly anywhere in the global south. And the reason is that the system has worked. That there was a little miracle that unfolded in that old courthouse in Philadelphia. That people were able to create a republic where the people in charge were looking over their shoulders at everyone else. Where power was democratized and dispersed and decentralized. Where the government feared the people rather than the other way around. That doesn't just happen on its own. Like the economic miracle in Mississippi, it requires people to be out there teaching, habituating the next generation, inculcating them with the values that will sustain that open and individualist society. That is the function of think tanks and institutes like this one. To preserve the extraordinary patrimony that you have been lucky enough to have from your parents and to pass it on securely to the next generation. So that's my closing plea. Honor the vision of your founders. Be certain to treat your freedoms as a precious heritage that you hold on a repairing lease, with a commensurate responsibility to pass it on. Never be afraid to speak to and for the soul of this great nation, of which, by good fortune and God's grace, you are privileged to be part. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Douglas will tell me when the time is up. I'll start with you, sir. Yes, please.
Thank you for that. You're singing my song. I was born in 1942, and as I began to learn to read and to study, etc., during the early 50s, I became a student almost in the Second World War because it fascinated me, because there were so many veterans coming home. And I can still hear the cries of their mothers when they were told their sons were dead on their front porches. And when I was a little boy, I can remember when I was 3 when the war ended. And I can remember my brother riding his bicycle up and down the street. They were wonderful. I'm glad we helped Europe. I'm glad we helped to salvage Western civilization. But I've always had a problem when I look back over the last 100 years and see that America had to go to Europe in 1918, 1919, etc., again in 1942. And I always had this nagging feeling that the Europeans didn't care so much about liberty because we always had to come and salvage them. And I may be wrong. You know, Mississippi has an old rule that said be nice. And one of the things I love about Donald Trump is he's not nice. He's truthful. He's a thug from Queens, and I love him. I voted for him twice. Because he says it like he sees it. And he's the first president to ever stand up to the Europeans and to say to them, get off it. Pay what you owe. Take care of yourselves first. And stop thinking that I'm going to be coming here to salvage you. I'm not. Deal with Putin yourself and stop playing games with oil and gas. Stop making us be the one to come and save you. I don't want to ever do that again. I don't want any of my grandchildren on European soil. I don't. It makes no sense. Show me first where your love for liberty is. Then I might consider coming to help you. We've had our own battles in this country. You know, slavery existed. You can go through the scriptures. It was still here 150 years ago. But we're hopefully coming into another era with that. We're learning how to appreciate one another, regardless of our faith, our color, whatever. We'll always find something. We'll probably go against curly hair next.
Yep.
But the point is, the United States is a great country. I know that. I love it. It's strong because we are strong.
Thank you.
But I don't ever again want to be told it's our duty to go and save Europe.
Sure. And it's not your duty. This is about shared values and shared interests, right? I was in the European Parliament for 21 years, and I was regularly told by continental colleagues, why do you Brits always just stick to American foreign policy? Are you like some kind of American battleship moored off Europe? Do you not think for yourselves, they go into Iraq or Afghanistan or Korea or wherever, you're always with them. Have you contracted out your foreign policy to the White House? And I would try and explain as courteously as I could that we had reached the same conclusions when confronted by the same challenge because we had been taught to think in a similar way by shared institutions. And that one of the things that that institutional heritage taught us was to bridle at injustice, to become indignant at bullying, and to be prepared to defend it in the final analysis with force. And that's why when you look at the lineup in those various conflicts in which your country has been involved over the last century and a bit, the coalition shifts and there are countries that come and go, but the core of the other English-speaking democracies is always there. In all of those conflicts, from the First World War to the Afghan campaign, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United Kingdom. And I don't think that's because we've made a calculation that we have to stick to Uncle Sam whatever, or because you supply our nuclear weapons or whatever. I think it's because we think the same way, because of this shared heritage going back through the Bill of Rights, through even the Magna Carta, to the folk right of Anglo-Saxon common law. But part of that is understanding that institutions are bigger than the people who pass through them. I think if I had to encapsulate the promise of the Constitution in one sentence, it's that. The institutions matter more than the people. As John Adams said, a government of laws and not of men. And that has served to bring the United States back from all of the occasional errors that every country commits, including the one that you mentioned. The campaign against slavery and then the campaign against segregation was made in American terms, not with reference to general universal values, but on grounds that the Constitution was being implicitly violated. When Martin Luther King made his speeches, he would speak about the founding documents as a promissory note. It's not an argument he could have made in Pakistan or Iran or China, right? He was saying this republic is falling short of the ideals on which it was founded, and people bought that argument, and in the end implemented the necessary changes. When he kept on saying in every speech, all men are created equal, he was making an America-specific argument. In other words, the promissory note, the documents now on the walls of the National Archives in DC, served to make people better. They gave people an ideal to which they should aspire, and people did indeed realize that ideal. So, of course, every country falls short sometimes. Mine does, yours does, every country in the world. But the fact that it falls short of great ideals is a compliment to those ideals, which constantly urge us to do better. And that's why I care so much about your Constitution. That's why I want to have so much more time and energy put into inculcating those values. Look, we're in a screen-addled, angry, impatient age. Somebody has to take the time to teach kids the things that really matter. Sir, yes. Yes, my Rolls-Royce friend. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Lord Hannon, thank you for being here. I very much enjoy listening to you. And also, how's the Brexit situation coming along in your country? And finally, I look forward to seeing you in England sometime.
Thank you very much. Well, I look forward to seeing you if you're able to come. Brexit, how is it coming along? I will not deny that I've been disappointed at how slow we have been to seize the opportunities that it opened up before us. It's important to stress that Brexit on its own was never going to add or subtract a penny from our economy. All it was going to do was remove constraints and allow us to make different choices. And how we exercise that choice was always going to be the thing that determined our prosperity. Now, I'll try and summarize it. I could speak for hours on this, but the single biggest problem we had, partly because we were distracted by the pandemic and the lockdown at the time, is that when we took the powers back from Brussels, instead of pushing them downwards and outwards to local authorities, or better yet, to private citizens, we left them festering in our bureaucracy, what you would call our administrative state. We took power from one lot of regulators in Brussels and placed it in the hands of another lot of regulators in Whitehall and in the rest of the UK. And they were every bit as risk-averse and anti-competitive and drenched in woke and DEI as the people from whom they had taken the power in the first place. And that's why we haven't seen anything like the changes that we ought to have seen, either in terms of domestic deregulation or in terms of foreign trade. We have done it's not that we've done nothing. We've got better rules on gene editing than we used to have. We've certainly got a much more competitive regime on AI than the European Union has, which hates the internet and wants to regulate it. And yes, we've got a better trade regime. We're now in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a great boon for our economy. These are the fastest growing countries in the world, but nothing like what we could have done. And the reason is that the people who control those powers now never wanted Brexit in the first place and can't really imagine a world in which we diverge from Brussels. But we'll get there. We'll get there. There's often there were moments here in the 1780s when it wasn't looking so great, but no country ever got poorer as a result of independence. And here we are about to celebrate 250 years. It looks to me like independence works out okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk, Rohan. I really enjoyed it.
Great question. Thank you.
My question was more about your third point regarding free trade and laissez-faire economics. I mean, here in Mississippi, the largest private employer is Anglosphere. It produces 70% of the United States Navy surface fleet. If we were to adopt radical laissez-faire free trade policies, that shipyard would close overnight. And I say that as someone who works in the shipping industry. There are a lot of structural reasons for that. Do you think that in light of the Western world's great power competition with China, there is a place for industrial policy and protectionism in certain critical national security sectors, or do you take the position that we should be, true barrierless economic model that's going to shake out more successfully?
Thank you, Luke. That's a really good question. Let's start with China. So I am very much at the hawkish end of the spectrum on China. I'm actually banned from China. I'm not allowed to set foot in China because I've been too critical of the regime there. And I can't go to China, Russia, or Belarus. All of my great holiday options have been cancelled by these authoritarian regimes. I don't know where I'm going to have to just stay in Mississippi. But I think China is actually a civilizational threat to us. And let me explain what I mean by that. There are countries with whom we quarrel, right? There are countries that don't like us very much. There are regimes that resent us, resent our liberties, resent our society, Iran or somewhere. Fine. I don't think Iran is holding out a realistic, categorical alternative to our way of life that other countries might buy into. But I think China might be, or at least that other governments might buy into. And I think we've been very slow to appreciate the speed at which China has used technology to build the kind of authoritarian state that would have been impossible a generation ago. When you see pictures of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang at roadblocks, checkpoints, I was always thinking, checkpoints for what? What are they looking for? And so I spoke to somebody who lived there, and he said, it's because everyone in that part of China is obliged to have a kind of mandatory spyware app on their phone. Right? The checkpoints are to ensure that you haven't taken the app off, or you've got some clever young nephew who's taken it off. Right? What does the mandatory spyware check for? Antisocial behavior. So not illegal, but antisocial behavior. What counts as antisocial behavior? Growing a beard, looking at the wrong websites, observing Ramadan, talking to foreigners. If you do these things, none of which is a crime, if you do too many of these things, the algorithm sentences you to mandatory re-education in a camp without any human supervision. Now here's the thing, if they can do that in the northwest of China, they can do it everywhere in China. With face recognition and geolocation, they can establish the kind of panopticon state, the kind of serious Huxleyan tyranny that up until now was impossible. And if they can do it anywhere in China, they can export it. They can say to the Venezuelan government or whatever, how would you like never have to worry about an election again? We'll sell you the tech, right? So this is why I preface what I'm about to say about trade by saying we should be absolutely ruthless in terms of standing up to communist China. What's the best way of doing that? Well, military readiness, possibly sanctions against individuals. But I cannot think of any occasion ever when trade sanctions have served to bring down a regime of which we disapprove. It didn't topple the Ayatollahs. It didn't topple Saddam Hussein. Fidel Castro, before he died, used to say, "It is only the Yankee blockade that kept me in power," by which he meant, I can blame the poverty in Cuba not on the rottenness of Marxist economics, but on the fact that we're besieged by a more powerful enemy. Right? Sanctions of any kind, and not doing a trade deal is, if you like, the weakest kind of sanction. Sanctions hurt the wrong people. They hurt ordinary people in your country and the other one, and they drive support for the regime, partly because people rally around the flag feeling besieged, and partly because a more controlled economy, which is what an economy less open to trade is, gives more power to the autocrats to control people's lives. So I think there are lots of things that we could be doing to be tougher with China. But we need to distinguish between the actual problems we have with China, which is, reverse engineering and stealing our tech, copyright violations, etc., which is happening now without any trade deal, right? That's nothing to do with tariffs, and a general rise in the cost of goods for Americans, which is what tariffs mean. It's also worth noting that tariffs are rarely a one-way street. You have a lot of soya farmers in this state, is that right? It's a big part of the Mississippian economy. And half of the soya from Mississippi was being sold to China. China now has a 44% tariff in retaliation for the Trump tariffs. None of those Mississippi soya farmers can sell to the Chinese market, right? I don't think that's anything to do with security. I don't think that's making it more or less likely that they'll invade Taiwan. It is just making Mississippian farmers forego a chunk of income to no strategic end. But I don't want to make you think that I'm indifferent. Let me put it like this: 90% of job losses in old industries are caused by technological change rather than by trade. And there is no force on earth that will keep old industries going once the invention has been made, whether it's in your country or anywhere else, that will allow a job that did take 100 men with shovels to be done by one machine. That's not a trade issue, that's a technology issue. When I was a politician, I'll be honest, I represented an area that had a lot of light industry. Right? There were not a lot of coal mines or steel mills in the southeast of England where I represented, but there was one exception, which was a shipyard, and a naval one like the one here. It was called Chatham in North Kent, and it employed 12,000 people at peak. And it closed at just the moment when all of our steel mills and coal mines were closing in the mid-80s. And to this day, there are people there who blame Margaret Thatcher, the evil witch Margaret Thatcher. She hated the working classes. I used to get this as the Conservative representative, you can imagine, right? And I never blamed them. Who would not feel as they did? You've got a perfectly good job as a welder or whatever, a skilled job, and then through no fault of yours, the structure of your life collapses, and you're going to work as a security guard. Of course you're going to be mad. You would be, I would be, right? But it's only fair to tell that story right through to the end. Going into the pandemic, unemployment in the constituency that contained that shipyard was below 2%. There are more people now working on the site of where Chatham Docks were than when it was a shipyard. Some of it is a university, we don't really talk about that, but the rest of it is all good, useful stuff, including particularly the audiovisual sector. It's a really big employer. It's where we film Sherlock, where we film Call the Midwife. In other words, the grandsons of those guys who were bashing metal for a living are now tapping at computer screens. Now, does that make it any better for the guys who lost their jobs? No. But most of us want our kids to live better than we did, right? I can't help noticing, by the way, that the people here who are the keenest on keeping alive these old industries, the Lighthouses and so on, they never want their sons to become coal miners. This is always for other people, right? They're not volunteering to do it themselves. My maternal grandfather was a shipyard worker on the Clyde in the west of Scotland. He had the typical unhealthy west of Scotland lifestyle. He smoked very heavily. He died when he was 61, I think. So I never met him. So I never had the chance to ask him whether he would have wanted to keep that industry going at whatever cost to the nation as a whole. But I have a pretty shrewd idea that if he could see what my cousins and I are doing for a living, he wouldn't hesitate. And by the way, that shipyard in the west of Scotland is still open. It's just that it now employs a couple of hundred people instead of the tens of thousands, right? It's still making high-quality ships competitively, but it's made that transition. And anyone who denies that transformation, which has happened in every generation, is holding out a false prospectus to the people involved. Some jobs become obsolete every year through natural change. And the challenge is to be open to investment so that something better comes along to replace them.
One last question.
One last question. Yes, please, sir.
How do
Thank you. Well, first of all, I don't think there was any agreement about this. The allegation, as far as I've understood it, is that it was mentioned to Yeltsin in a phone call, but there's no written treaty about NATO expansion, and there couldn't be.
Not an actual Minsk agreement on a document?
The only Minsk agreement I'm aware of is the Minsk talks about the current war in Ukraine. I don't think there was any. I'm open to persuasion on this, but whenever I've asked people to show me any proof of this, they've never come up with anything. But in a way, none of that matters, because my argument is not that Zelensky is a great Democrat, or that it's right or wrong to insist on a language policy of this or that kind. None of that matters. The fact is that one country was invaded by another without any claim on its territory. I mean, it wasn't that Russia said this was always historically Russian land. They just decided to move in. And imagine if every country started doing that every time it had a problem with a neighbour. Right? During the Brexit negotiations, we were dealing with a very difficult and obstreperous government in Dublin that was making every difficulty it could in order to try and put pressure on us in an unrelated area. Diminished as we are as a military force, I'm pretty sure we could have taken the Irish, but it wouldn't have occurred to anyone to do that, because imagine what the world would be like if you started resolving every dispute by invading a country because it was smaller than you. And that, it seems to me, is the principle that's at stake here. It doesn't really matter, whether Zelensky had an unwilling cameo role in the Hunter Biden laptop affair, and none of that should count for anything. What matters here is that we gave our word, you and we, to defend the borders of a country within its existing sovereign, international recognized frontiers. By the way, the last escalation here should have made some people focus, I think. We had the meeting in Alaska. The red carpet was literally rolled out for Putin. Interesting, by the way, I just saw the State Department sanctioning this judge in Brazil for going after, for a human rights violation, and yet we were literally rolling out the red carpet for Putin. Right? And Trump said, if I understood it correctly, there are going to be very severe consequences if there's not an immediate ceasefire by the Russians. Right? And how did Putin respond? Not only did he not agree to a ceasefire, he escalated. There was the second biggest drone and missile attack of the entire war in Kiev. There was a number of American-owned factories and businesses were hit, some of them so far in Western Ukraine that they were virtually in Bratislava. That would have once been regarded as a serious attack on this country. Nobody mentions it. The British Council was bombed in a residential part of Kiev. The EU embassy was bombed. Now, guys, I'm not a great believer in international law, but one thing that I think we can all agree on is the sanctity of diplomatic missions, right? I mean, even at the height of the Second World War, when mutually opposed ideologies were battling to extirpate each other, diplomats didn't have to worry about being murdered. They were peacefully evacuated through third countries, right? So here is Putin, like the Ayatollahs in 1978, deliberately saying, I don't follow your rules, I can attack your embassies. Where are the very severe... I heard a Fox presenter asking the president, so what are the very severe consequences that you promised? And he said, well, Zelensky is no angel. Sure, but so what? I really don't think we should get bogged into saying I like this or that candidate or would have voted for this or that one. The issue is, do we defend the international order from which the US and the UK have been huge beneficiaries, which has existed since 1944 and has its roots in the Atlantic Charter of 1941, which rests on the inviolability of frontiers and on a refusal to allow the changing of them by force? Or do we rip all of that up and go back to a world of Machtpolitik and of convenience and power? And I think if we do the latter, we are very, very soon going to start looking back to the post-war era and wondering in what fit of madness we threw it away.
That was a tour de force. Dan, thank you so much for coming. I know I saw a number of hands up for further questions. Please do. Dan will be available if you want to have a chat or a selfie or tell him why he's wrong or tell him why he's right. Please do feel free to come and have a chat. I just want to say once again, thank you so much for coming. We're pretty much out of time now. If any of you happen to be in and around Oxford in this time tomorrow, 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, Dan will be speaking to a large gathering of students in Oxford, talking about some of these ideas. We would love to see you there. It would be great if you could make it. I also just really wanted to say next month we are having a gala that celebrates Mississippi's success. We have the governor as our guest speaker, and we also have Rich Lowry, the editor of the National Review, and they will both be talking about some of the great achievements that Mississippi and Liberty have accomplished. So look in your email inboxes, please, for invitations to that. We would love to see you at that. I think that's going to be a great opportunity. Finally, thank you again for coming. It's been a wonderful opportunity to hear from Dan. Dan, thank you so much for that magnificent discussion. And thank you all for coming. See you next time. Thanks.